Well, hi there, everyone, and welcome to another week of the good news according to Job. So glad that you are joining us, and hope that you are looking forward to this week as we unpack yet again another section of Job in the shorter study on Job. And so we are flying through at this rate, and we are entering the last sections of Job. But hopefully from last week we got a nice overview of what is all going on in between, in one sense, the introduction and Job's first cry and cursing of his life to the end of his friends' discourse. And so last week we looked at the three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and what they have to say and the type of wisdom that they used, and how that interplays a little bit with who Job is and what Job has to say. And then we turned to Elihu, and we ended there with him and what he has to say, and how he helped us to some degree to look to God, but yet he came to the same conclusion that Job did, that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did, that ultimately Job must have done something wrong, and for that reason he must repent, confess his sins, and God will then prosper him. And so unfortunately that was the outcome of Zophar, and we were expectant of maybe a little bit more from what his name represents, and hoping that he would have a slightly different insight. But nonetheless he is still human, and failed to communicate and to share with Job the deeper truth that we are hopefully going to begin to see as we hear from the Lord, as the Lord speaks in this new section today. So the section that we are looking at, just to let you know, is chapter 38 through to 41 to the end. And so we're going to pick up on that section, and that's essentially where the Lord speaks to Job. And before we get to that, I want to pick up one last little thing that Job did mention and did say the last time that he spoke. But if you remember, it was Job that spoke, a lengthy section, and then followed by Elihu. And then Job never spoke again. But I want to pick up on just something that Job did say. And let's just quickly turn there again. So it's in 31, Job 31, verse 35. And he says this: "Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a ruler." And so, just to sum up, essentially at this point, what Job is saying is he's calling out, he's saying, this is my defense, I have signed it, I am here in this courtroom, I am waiting, Lord, give me an answer, speak to me. And so he waits for God to speak to him. And God does. God is about to speak to him. But he speaks not immediately. He speaks after Elihu. And it begins like this. So let's notice how it begins. It said, "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said." And this is how it starts. There is a break in between. And we pick it up again in chapter 40, verse 6, when it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm." And so twice we are told that the Lord God speaks to Job out of the storm. And I think this is quite significant for us to just pick up on right up front, is that when God speaks, it is different to how Job speaks, it's different to how the friends speak. When God speaks at this point, he speaks out of a storm. And this is significant, not simply because it is a violent type of thing, it's an aggressive, loud, whatever you want to use to paint the picture. If you think of lightning and rain and hail and winds as a storm represents, but it is also something that is created. It is something part of God's creation. And so when God speaks out of the very things that he has created, in the form of a storm, in the form of this wind and rain and lightning and thunder and all sorts of other elements. And God is speaking out of that. This is furthermore significant by what is going to follow from mainly in chapter 38 is how God speaks about his creation. So out of his creation he speaks about his creation. And what he does here is essentially he takes Job by the hand and he takes him to Genesis. And really he walks with Job and he asks him an array of rhetorical questions running all the way through the Lord's discourse or the Lord's response to Job. There is an array of rhetorical questions, one after the other, of God speaking to Job. But in this first section, chapter 38, God is really taking Job by the hand and saying, let's look at creation. Let's look at the day that I created it all. Let's look at the day when I created and laid the foundation. Let's look at the day when I created day and night. Let's look at the day when I hoisted the stars into the heavens. Let's look at that day when I created the sea and separated the sea and the sky. So significant moments that is highlighted in this section, different days of God's creation being highlighted. But God is essentially painting this picture for Job of saying, Job, I created all of these things. But he asks Job. So the first question that he asks Job is this. He says here, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? And so this is the rhetorical question. We know the answer is God, because it is only God that can create, and from nothing. And God created all of this, and he asks Job, where were you when I created, when I laid the foundations? Where were you? And so right up front, it already brings us down to size. The first question that God asks out of leading Job through the creation is he brings us to size. He brings Job down to size in a sense of saying, remember, you are part of this creation. So where were you when I laid the foundation? And this is quite interesting. It's phenomenal that God is pointing to this, and he is showing not only his creation, but he is showing that he has created all of these things in wisdom. So when it comes to God having created the sea and the sky and the heavens and the rain and the mountains and all the things that he goes on to list in chapter 38, the Lord has created them all in wisdom. And we pick that up toward the end of chapter 38. So if you'll look there, chapter 38, he says this in verse 36, who gives the ibis wisdom, or gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens? And so right up front of this first section, at least, the Lord is saying to Job, who has the wisdom? Or who has given the wisdom, or who has the wisdom to have done this and to have created in the way that it is created? And the answer is, it is the Lord. It is the Lord that has the wisdom to create in the way that he has created. So just to pause there, this creates quite an interesting tension between perhaps what is said in the beginning by Job when he curses the day of his birth. He curses the day of his birth, and he's frustrated because of the pain and suffering that he has faced, and he feels that he would rather have gone from womb to grave rather than had to live a life in this world with pain and suffering. And yet God is not outright rebuking him for saying something that he's not rebuking Job for saying something wrong per se, but he is pointing to Job that even though it is not the way Job would want it, the reason for Job is there is wisdom even in his own creation, in the own essence of who he is as a person. God created him in wisdom. So Job's life is a representation of wisdom. All of life is a representation of wisdom, and that is God's wisdom. So we might not always have wisdom to give, but our life represents a creator of wisdom, a creator that is in himself the wisest of all things that we could possibly begin to even imagine. And we see aspects of his wisdom woven into his creation. So when he paints the picture of the ibis, for example, it is a picture of how does the ibis know when to move, when the Nile is going to flood, is essentially that kind of idea. How do birds know when they need to move and migrate and do all of those things? And furthermore, he says, or gives the rooster understanding. The rooster that knows when day is breaking. How does it know to crow when the day is breaking? So this is interesting that we pick that up. That even in God's creation, we see wisdom woven into the things that he has created. And so for Job to say, curse the day of my birth, God is saying, but I have created you in wisdom. And that's on one side of it. There is much more to that. It's not simply God speaking directly to that situation, but that there is wisdom in God's creation. It's not chaos. It's not disorderly. There is a reason for it. There is wisdom and purpose and understanding in it. And we don't always fully understand it. But God is the God of wisdom, and he does. And he knows exactly what he is doing in his creation. The next thing that I want to pick up on, so that first section of 38, running to 38 verse 1, running to the end, or almost the end of that chapter to verse 38 there, it really encapsulates these ideas of not so much animals, but all of things like the stars, the sea, the mountains, the storehouses of the heavens, and that being not only that of the stars, but of rain and lightning and thunder. And so it's these things, all of these creational aspects that are not living in the sense of like creatures. And so he paints that picture, and it's something that we pick up quite strongly most of the way through. And it's very much similar to the first section of the creation account in Genesis, where God creates the earth. He separates the water from the sky. He creates then day and night. He creates all of these other elements that he highlights, and then he moves on to the creation of creatures. And so we see that progression happening in Job here in the end of chapter 38, where it begins. It says, do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens, or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? And so from there we see the progression going on into chapter 39, and that runs all the way to the end of chapter 39, where God is talking about all these animals, and he asks these rhetorical questions again about the animals and how God has created these animals yet again in wisdom. So when God asks these questions, just to pick up a few, we can turn to verse 5. Who let the wild donkey go free? Who untied its ropes? Jump down a little bit further, verse 13. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and the feathers of the stork. She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand. And so these images of animals and creation in that format is highlighted, and these questions get asked in between as it goes. But it's incredible. So this is where the Lord is drawing Job's attention now to the creation, the animals, the nature around us, and he says to Job, well, Job, where were you when I created that? Did you orchestrate those things? And again, he picks up on wisdom in verse 26 of chapter 39. Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and build its nest on high? So again, wisdom coming into it. Does the creatures act in wisdom? Does nature, in all of its existence, whether it's animal or creation in the form of mountains or sea or trees, is it created in whose wisdom? And the answer is that it is God's wisdom that these things are created. And so that's essentially the first section of the Lord's response to Job. Chapters 38 and 39 really solidify for us this creation image of all of these various things coming together, and God saying, well, I have created all of those things in my wisdom. All of those things have been created in the wisdom that I have. And so Job is minute in comparison to even that wisdom. And Job, being a creature within God's creation, falls under God's creational wisdom that far surpasses his own wisdom. And so this is quite phenomenal. And this isn't just true for Job. This is true for Job's friends as well. And that their wisdom is even under the dynamic, wonderful aspect of God's wisdom that he created with. So the very wisdom that is imprinted in his creation is greater than the wisdom of any person. And so by the end of, in one sense, you almost feel that it's almost makes the discourses before a little bit redundant, to say that why couldn't God have spoken sooner? Because all these things that they have said is helpful and true and interesting, but it lacks in the wisdom that God has. So if God could have spoken with his wisdom, wouldn't that have helped us? But it is helpful for us to recognize that those things are important for us to then see how God's wisdom is actually highlighted in the lack of wisdom that we as human beings actually have. And that what we bring to the table is limited by our own knowledge and our own capabilities and capacities, but that it is God that goes beyond that. That we can't box God into our own understanding, into our own mind, into whatever we think who he is, but that he far supersedes the very thinking that we have about him. And that's really amazing. It's really amazing that we can see that up front. The next section that we will quickly glance at is chapter 40 and 41. But we will highlight this again next week. But in between, what breaks things up a little bit here is in 40 verse 3, is you have Job that speaks very briefly. Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. So what Job is highlighting here is he's saying, I have no words. I can't answer you. I realize that you are a God of absolute wisdom. And my wisdom, actually, it comes from you, but I can't speak. As your creation, I can't answer you. You are the God who, out of your own wisdom, has created all things. And Job here, his first thing that he says is, I am unworthy. He is humbled by the immensity of God and his ability to create. The next thing that I want to highlight for us is God is about to speak again. So it picks up there in verse 6, where we looked at earlier on, that it says, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. And then God he begins to shift the focus of what he's about to say. And he first highlights an aspect of justice. So let's read there quickly. It says, brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like this? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor, and clothe yourself in honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at all who are proud and bring them low. Look at all who are proud and humble them. Crush the wicked where they stand, but bury them all in the dust together, shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. And so essentially what God is saying here is, if you can prove to me that you are mighty, that you are great, that you can essentially save yourself, then I will acknowledge that. But the reality is Job can't. And what is highlighted here is the reality for all of mankind. And we see how that has run through history. The man has always tried to scheme and figure out a way to save himself. But man cannot save himself. Man is incapable of saving himself. And then God goes on in verse 15 to paint this picture of the behemoth. And then again in the verse 1 of chapter 41, he paints the picture of the Leviathan. And so these are the two images that is created as a final two images. And the first image of the behemoth is this incredible, immense, massive creature. If you read it closely, you see the immensity of this creature. Its tail is that of a cedar tree. I mean, it's painted in such a massive light that this thing is huge, and it is something that God has created and has control over. And what we can speculate all sorts of things as to what those creatures are, but I think what is significant is that God can create an incredible creature, so massive, so big, but on one level it is also beyond our understanding. This is a creature that eats plants and that lives a private life in one sense. And so God is able to create immenseness, but in humility. And so that's quite an incredible image, that this immensely huge creature can be such an image of humility. And that, if you read it, you might pick that up and see it. It seems quite peculiar. That why such a big creature? Why not be a fierce, ferocious big creature? But this one is almost a shy creature, that it hides away under the lilies or the plants of water, or amongst the reeds. So that's curious. Why is it like that? And then the next one that the Lord paints is the Leviathan, this creature of the sea, this immensely powerful, strong creature that has flames coming from its mouth, that is so ironclad almost in its way that it's been created. And God's saying, well, I have created that. And the Leviathan, once again, is also that image of chaos. So this chaos kind of image, this creature of the sea that rules the world, the sea, and all that is in it, is quite an interesting picture in contrast then with the behemoth. That God can create both a creature of humility or gentleness in size, though it's massive, it can be gentle, or a creature in immense power and chaos and all of that. And so God has the power to create all sorts of things. God has the power to create massively large things that can be both humble and ferocious, that can be both incredibly strong but yet gentle, while also incredibly strong and violent. And so I thought that is something worth just considering. It's just an interesting picture, but it's again a picture here of God being able to create in his wisdom. And so that is just something worth contemplating over. Perhaps what God is, what the Lord is showing and demonstrating to Job here, is once again the wisdom in his ability to create, the wisdom in who God is, to do things however he sees fit. That it is maybe in our mind we expect a certain thing, but yet God can do it however he sees fit. And God is a wise God in how he creates and how he does things. So in saying that, I don't want to go into all the details of that, and maybe by the time if you end up doing the long course, the long study as we work through Job, we'll get to this again and go into a little bit more deeper thoughts on it and unpack it a little bit more. But as for this one, hopefully that just gives us a feeling of God really demonstrating to Job, taking him by the hand and saying, look at my creation, look at what I have done, and consider who is wise. Who is wise? Is it your friends? Is it you? Or is it me who has created all these things in a way that only truly makes sense to me? And even when you look at it, it might not even make sense. And God is a God that has created in his way, however he sees fit. And so as we get to the end of this section, I don't want to just leave us there, but I really want to see how this transpires and contemplate that for a moment, how God does things in his wisdom. We look at how history has unfolded for Israel. They have been a nation that has faced enemies, monstrosities, nations that have been ferocious and torn them apart, and literally taken them into exile and left them desolate. And yet God has created a plan. Before the foundations, he had created the plan of salvation. Job here is pointed out, he is challenged, and he is not able to save himself. Just like Israel was not able to save themselves. But they longed for a king to save them. But a king had to not only just be a king to rule over them and to reign, but to be able to save them. And the biggest issue is not salvation from an enemy, but salvation from the greatest problem there is, and that is sin and death. And so when we look to Job and see that the question of salvation is thrown out there, we know that Job couldn't save himself. We know that Israel as a nation couldn't save themselves. And yet, as we go into the New Testament, people are waiting in anticipation at this point for a king to come, and rule over them, to reign and to conquer the enemy. And God, out of his wisdom, sends his son Jesus Christ. And it is not entirely what is expected. Jesus arrives into the world and goes far more in the route of Job than he does of a king, maybe like David, that they would have been expecting, longing for a king to vanquish the enemy. But in comes Jesus, and in God's wisdom, God sends his son to die on a cross. For us, we look at it, and I think the world at that time would have looked at it too, in absolute perplexity. How could this save us? The only hope of salvation, the King that you promised us, and that you have said, sent into this world, and you have said has arrived, is now hanging on a cross. How is this salvation? And in that moment where Christ was on the cross, he had endured such hardship, such turmoil in so many ways. And when we look at that, we can only be in awe of God's wisdom. But it is only once we see Christ, not only his death, but his resurrection, that we truly get a glimpse of the wisdom that God has. That the only way that God could conquer our biggest problem is that he had to send his one and only son to live a pure and spotless life, and then to die on our behalf, so that through him we can have life. So when we look at Job, and when we kind of consider what is being demonstrated there, God is showing Job his wisdom and how he has orchestrated and created and done things. That God has created us, and that we are, however, fallen creatures, but that the only way that God can then correct the greatest problem of sin and death in this world is through his wisdom, and that wisdom is found in his son Jesus Christ. And for us, and a lot of the world maybe around us, it seems peculiar, but the wisdom is so profound that God enters into this world through his son Jesus Christ. And that is God's wisdom coming to life for us in an incredible sense. And so we rejoice in that. We find that an incredible eye-opener for God's kind of wisdom. It far exceeds our own. We would have looked for a king like the rest of the nations, like John asked in question of Jesus, are you the king that we are waiting for? And so when we look at Job, when we consider what has happened all the way through Job to this point, the question is, do we look at our human wisdom, trying to understand things by what we can analyze and understand and learn from our parents or from textbooks? Or are we looking to a God that puts a new spin on wisdom altogether? That his wisdom goes beyond our understanding? That his wisdom can't be quantified and can't be squished into our tiny little brains, because we are part of his creation, and we as part of his creation are created in his wisdom. But his wisdom can't be captured within us in its fullness. So we can't contain all of God's wisdom, but we get glimpses of it. And this is encouraging. So looking at Job, a book of wisdom, one of the greatest places to go, and that's what God does, is to take a look at how he has created all of creation. And God takes Job by the hand and leads him to Genesis, and he says, where were you? Where were you? So you are sitting in a position where you are in pain and suffering and hardship. Where were you when God created it all? Where were you when God orchestrated all things? Who do you think can save you? Do you think you can save yourself? Do you think someone else that is just like you can save you? Or is it only God that can truly save you? And that's the answer, in one sense, to Job's problem. Job's problem is wrapped up in the fact that God is a wise God. He is incredibly wise, far beyond what we can even begin to imagine. And it is only through his wisdom that he can save us. So may that encourage you. May it, in one sense, also set you free from trying to save yourself, and recognize that the only one that can save you is the Lord God himself. And he has done that for us through our Lord Jesus Christ. So I hope that encourages you. I hope that you will go and think about it and go and read Job 38 to 41 again. And I hope that, you continue to wrestle with this. Because as Job is packed with wisdom, it really challenges us on our own thinking and how we perceive life and what we think we can do. So enjoy reading through Job again, work through it, take time and contemplate it further. And otherwise we'll see you next week, and we'll look at the last section. So read chapter 42 for next week, and hopefully we can tie it all up then. So we'll see you then. Cheers, bye.